Do you know what I hate?
Yeah.
Tim Tams that aren't perfectly aligned.
That makes
The
sense
top
for you.
biscuit and the bottom biscuit are like just slightly off-centered, and it's just like, just line the up.
What's your Tim Tam of choice?
I don't really like Tim Tams. Just standard
Trust you
Tim
to
Tam.
not like them, but then also have a very strong opinion about them? Or is this contributing to why you don't like them?
No. It's very much the first.
Okay. I can hear that's something that you feel very strongly about.
All right. Don't go all therapy voice with me. I know when you're going that way. All right, come on, let's go.
Do you
next
want a Tim
episode.
Tam? Will that make you feel better?
No, it won't.
And if that Tim Tam's not straight, that's going to send you over the edge.
Yeah, okay. Hello and welcome. Trying to get a cheap laugh from Eleanor there. Hello and welcome to the Integration Station. I'm your host, Michael, a child and adolescent occupational therapist, and with me today is Eleanor.
I'm also a child and adolescent occupational therapist.
Welcome, Eleanor.
Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. We today are going to be talking about primitive reflexes.
We are. We're going to cut our usual segments and we're just going to get straight into it, hey?
Straight into it. A question came through from a lovely young OT from Reno
Yes.
in Nevada.
And that's the format we normally take in this podcast, a
Yeah.
Q&A format to support the young people in our lives.
We do. And we had a question come through in the old email. And it was, I have a question for you both regarding primitive reflexes. Lately, we've had many clients come to our clinic interested in having their children tested for retained primitive reflexes.
Yes.
Right, we've been there. They've heard it could be the reason for their child's difficulties in school or issues like tactile defensiveness. I'm curious, do you test for primitive reflexes with your own children? And if so, have you observed retained reflexes often? If a child shows signs of retained reflexes, do you typically provide home exercise programs? Additionally, I'm interested to know if you educate parents on the benefits of play and AIR's sensory integration, and if you find these approaches potentially more beneficial. Great question.
And can I share with you as well, I feel like I've been managing lots of similar questions from families coming through the practice. I did an assessment recently and the family was checking in with me about primitive reflexes. I was having a conversation with some staff on site the other day and we'd actually had this whole conversation which is essentially all around this. And then that afternoon this question came through. I was like, guys, you just won't believe it. Had a question come through for the podcast. So it felt like it's something that lots of people are talking about, lots of information out there and trying to understand, well, what does it all mean and how does that relate to my young person and what are the next steps?
We have always had an interest in primitive reflexes, but I would say if you check out our socials, our national director, Dino, did do a little bit of a snippet on
a couple of series as part of the Bub Club.
On primitive reflexes and what they're for and how we, I guess, treat them, if you will. Treat as in not medically treat, but how we understand them and their role and what they mean. There are a whole range of primitive reflexes. So first and foremost, what are primitive reflexes?
Yes.
And the primitive reflexes, designed to allow for a range of things. Some are designed to allow for a baby to come out of the birth canal to allow them to come out that way. And sometimes you hear of this person has retained reflexes because they were born via cesarean section and those sort of things. And there are multiple theories around reflexes and how they can be retained and whatnot. But those reflexes designed to support a young person in those first 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
And you can test for them in a range of ways. And often you'll see a doctor or pediatrician who will test those reflexes as a way to determine whether or not there are some underlying potential neurological challenges there for that young person. So first and foremost, there's that. So
I think if I was to add to that, I guess the whole purpose of the reflex, right, is that it's not a conscious thought process. It's something that can happen automatically. And
Correct.
yes, a lot rooted in these general survival requirements in the early stages before a lot of that conscious thought and that more elevated planning and problem solving in the movements come through.
And often when I talk about reflexes, I remember I don't do it as much now, and I think this probably comes back to the question, but in the early days when I think we were using reflexes more in our testing and assessments and in integrating reflexes in our therapy and home activities, I would always use the example of, the knee-jerk reflex. You hit the patella and boom,
Yes.
and it's that automatic response that your body has no control over. And some people I know think of reflexes as like, great reflexes to get down and save that goal or shot, where that's reaction time. It's a very different thing. Reflexes is an automatic response from the nervous system that just happens.
Yes.
There's no control over that. So yes, very fundamentally, that's really important to just put that out there. But what are some of the reflexes? Can you name some?
I can name some. There's I know there's quite a few, but I'm thinking about some of those early stages, like that Moro reflex, the startle, hands back.
Yep.
When you have that movement input to support that. And there's lots for when thinking about little babies, where if you have your hands near their hand, that they'll be able to grasp around that. Yeah, the palmer, and with their feet as well.
Yes.
When you move your finger along the base of their foot, what the actions of their toes look like, which does shift depending on how old they are as well.
I've got a list of them here as well.
Fabulous.
Which helps me. Because I forget, this is
some
not
of them are very complex names too,
Yeah. And there's a whole bunch here that I think, as OTs, we don't see a lot of children under the age of 1.
Yes.
Right? So a lot of these reflexes should be integrated. And what does that mean? It means that those reflexes are no longer present when you provide that input or that movement, or you elicit that response. So, you said the Moro reflex, you talked about the palmar grasp. There's one called the the asymmetric tonic neck reflex, the spinal galant reflex. There's the STNR, the symmetric tonic neck reflex, the Landau reflex, TLR, tonic labyrinthine reflex, and the rooting reflex, as examples of one that we do see. And so what I should say, and the question came back to what do we do with them? How do we test them? Do we try and integrate them? I always caveat reflexes with, if we do see that they're integrated, and if we see that they have not been integrated, by that I mean that if we did a test, then we would still see the presence of that.
Yes.
Then is that a reason to be significantly concerned for that young person? Or is it more of a retained reflex can just be a sign of maybe there is some neurological immaturity there, and if functionally bigger picture stuff, everything's okay, then it's just a sign of a slightly retained reflex.
Yes, yeah.
So we, over the years, have done various tests or assessments for looking at reflexes and reflex integration. And the ones that I would use most commonly are things like the ATNR reflex, the STNR reflex, the TLR reflex, or that tonic labyrinthine reflex, the Moro reflex. And what I'm looking at there is understanding if that reflex is, if everything else is integrated, but that reflex is still retained, why is that occurring? And is that something where we provide input or we provide activities just to work on that? Or is it just that person's got that retained reflex, but functionally everything else is okay? I think that's more of a bigger question. But I mean, I could spend a lot of time talking about different reflexes. I got a table here of all the different things and what they look like and what that can mean. But if I take one, for example, if I just said, look, the ATNR reflex, right? What it assists with, and that's the one that's very much the birth canal. We talk about it's like the fencing position, arms come through, help to go through that way. So you can't see that on audio, but my one arm's out and the other one's out to the other side. And some of the functional challenges or the things you might see are difficulties with hand-eye coordination, poor handwriting, uncoordinated gait, poor balance, poor visual motor skills, difficulties with reading, crossing midline. And I go, wow, that's a heap of stuff. Yeah. And no wonder a parent would say, oh, is that because of a retained reflex, or is it because of a whole bunch of other sensory integrative challenges that are occurring? So sometimes it can be really hard to say that it's purely a retained reflex that's causing these functional challenges.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's where, as the question came back to, what about something like air sensory integration? And what we do is we do a comprehensive assessment that looks at a range of sensory motor and sensory areas, and helps us understand a bit more about that young person's sensory profile.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're, I think with what you've referenced there with that list, we recognize that when families come through for our practice, and maybe there's some opportunities there in terms of how we move, how coordinated we are, what our attention looks like, emotional regulation and things like that, that when I'm going, well, these are some of the functional challenges that I'm noting for my young person, and I can see with a retained ATNR reflex, this is what that might look like. That can seem like a really, a very straight solution or explanation, and I can really understand in families looking to understand, but where is this rooted in? How can I support that? But I guess, like you've mentioned, is it solely just the retained reflex, or actually is it just that broader immaturities within our nervous system that's really contributing to that? And I think we have certainly found as a practice, we used to do a lot around reflex testing and having that be a very active part of our assessment process. But we've really moved away from that a lot, because I think the evidence behind directly testing and then supporting with retained reflexes as a standalone intervention is quite mixed. But looking at something like air sensory integration and looking at the assessments that help understand from a holistic picture, we're looking at that young person as a whole and going, well, beyond that, what is it maybe that's contributing to some of these difficulties? And that really direct correlation between a retained reflex and what some of these functional things can look like. I think the evidence behind that it really is quite mixed. And so what we find then, rather than test for that specifically, if we're going down this approach that is broader, more holistic, more all-encompassing with functional focuses, that actually a lot of the time in the movements and the play that we explore, that naturally is a lot of the movements that you might do to support retained reflexes. Yeah. So if you're supporting the nervous system as a whole, there's opportunities within that might help support that. Even if we're not directly testing for that, it's just the natural movement and play supports that integration regardless.
Yeah.
And why do we care about the reflexes? They do play a foundational role in those early stages in the movement and feeding and survival and birth. But as children naturally move and grow, that's what supports that integration. So that's what we then look to have as part of the therapy as well.
I think that's exactly what it is, you can do the test, but at the same time, if you purely do reflex testing as a standalone thing, you're missing a bigger picture.
Yeah.
It's like I wouldn't just do one assessment item for one child and then say, okay, because their handwriting is poor, that means that all these other things are challenging. It's important to have it as a battery. And to answer the question, anybody out there that does do reflex testing, when we would do some reflex testing in our initial assessments, it would be part of a battery of clinical observations.
Yes.
And that would include postural observations. It would include oculomotor observations. It would include some reflex testing, some things to do with bilateral coordination and
equilibrium reactions,
kinesthesia and all those things, right? So there are different programs like rhythmic movement training. I know is a big reflex integrative program that people do, and there's training for that. And I guess the evidence on that is still mixed. And I guess that's where we are always looking to proceed with caution and understand that this forms part of it and can be useful, but it's not something that I would be using exclusively or indicating because of a retained reflex. That's why they are having X, Y, and Z functional challenges. The one thing I would say is the Moro reflex is definitely something that out of all of those that I do see for some kids as having a really big functional impact. Now, why? The reason is because that startle response, particularly so in the easy assessment, the AIRS evaluation and sensory integration, the newest one, there's a test in there which more or less elicits a Moro response.
Yeah.
And it is the chair gets tilted backwards and you will see whether someone arms out, Moro reflex response or not. Now, that can happen, but I find that it's the response after that and how much of an impact that has on that person in the moments following gives you an impact of how much of an impact functionally that potential retained reflex is having. So I have some kids who won't lie on their back. I have some kids that avoid going swimming backstroke or don't like lying on their back in swings because that response is so overwhelming for them.
Yes.
Right. And so I go, okay, yes, maybe in that situation, that retained reflex can be quite problematic. And then we can look at that in saying that. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other things going on as well.
For sure.
But I definitely feel that there are some here that can, at least in those initial stages, give further further understanding as to why functionally things might be occurring.
Yeah.
So look, whilst we don't always assess for these, we certainly are on the lookout for them.
Yeah.
And it forms part of our assessment process. You know, we assess, we don't guess. We try and make sure we see as much as we can. And in terms of integrating stuff, if we think it's a functional challenge, or if a parent goes, I really want to retain, do that, I go, well, okay, here are some exercises.
Let's work on it together. Absolutely.
It's only going to help.
Yeah.
It's only going to help. And I think sometimes when we understand that, and it comes back to a previous episode where we're talking about, you know, parent on board with therapy and the other one not, say one comes in going, I'm all about reflexes and I want to work on that, and the other parent goes, I don't believe in that stuff at all.
Yeah.
You can certainly take that on board and say, well, let's do our therapy. Let's understand some of that. Let's put it into our practice. Here are some homework activities. If you see a change, you know, is it the reflex integration activities or is it doing sensory integration therapy as a whole?
Yeah.
Like, it's hard to answer that.
It is hard. It is hard.
But I don't want to strip them away either, because at the end of the day, whether it's reflex integration stuff or whether it's pure sensory integration therapy, it's all targeting the nervous system and how we respond and the adaptive responses of the nervous system. So it's all going to target similar things.
Yeah, for sure. And so I guess for any OTs out there who are curious around, well, what should this look like in my practice? I guess, you know, reflecting on our own primitive reflex testing was something that we had very actively incorporated, have moved away from this to a degree to look at sensory integration as a whole, but knowing that there's absolutely opportunities to explore that, set targeted activities around to facilitate that, but knowing that the therapy space naturally supports movements that will ideally help the integration of those reflexes. But that's not to say that you have to have a set of fully integrated reflexes to be a functional human. You know, I even think, I remember when I was learning about some of these reflexes and one of the OTs here had a retained
ATNR
very
reflex. Obvious, yeah.
But a very functional, very capable human being. And I think it's, you know.
And the retained rooting reflex, I remember she also had a retained.
Oh, really?
Yeah, very much so.
And so I think that probably just shows about that mixed result, you know, even just anecdotally about for an adult who has finished school, finished the university degree and is now working, that has retained reflexes, which hasn't impacted her capacity to lead the life that she wants to. So it's just that understanding of, we're probably just considering that person as they are and their functional goals and what they're looking to work towards. And if it's not a problem, it's also not a problem. So I think, it's just a piece of a very complex puzzle that is the human experience and development. And then just understanding, well, what support's required to facilitate that and how you approach that. I guess there's lots of things that you can use to explore that further.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if anything, if you're not sure, then you consult a doctor, you consult a allied health professional that's in that field and they can guide you, or listen to this episode and hopefully that provides a bit of insight as well.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's a dive into reflexes, and
keep an eye on our socials as we do a little bit further with some of the Bob Club stuff. So if you are interested, we certainly are having a bit of a look at that at the moment and what that looks like.
Lots of babies around.
Yeah. And you can always reach out to us as well if you have any questions.
Podcast at ocfcgroup.au.
Or our Instagram page, our OTFC group.
Perfect. All right. Speak to you next time.
Thanks, everyone.